So now let us turn to part 3, the rise of modern science, mostly in the 18th and 19th centuries. Well, the beginning of the end for spontaneous generation actually came in the late 1660s, when Francesco Redi did his famous experiments placing meat in jars, some with mesh coverings and some without. Only the jars that were left open developed maggots, providing strong evidence that maggots were delivered by insects and not generated from the meat itself. However, transmutation in the great chain of being persisted into the 18th century. Buffon, who wrote a series of influential natural history books, went through a number of paradigm shifts in his own works. In the first volume of his book, he's explicit in his commitment to a chain of being without gaps, that any classification above the individual is arbitrary. He wrote, "In general, the more one increases the number of one's divisions, in the case of natural products, the nearer one comes to the truth, since in reality individuals alone exist in nature, while genera, orders, classes exist only in our imagination." When Buffon uses terms like classes and orders, he's referring to the work of Carl Linnaeus, who began structuring a classification system in the 1730s and finally became crystallized by around 1758. Linnaeus invented a system that is still often used today, where species most similar are grouped together into genera, similar genera are grouped together into families, and so on. Unlike Buffon, Linnaeus was a strong proponent of species fixism. If species were not real entities, then there would be nothing to classify. In this fixed species vein, Linnaeus established the practice of picking one or a few individuals, usually stored in a museum, which would be used as the type specimen. For example, if a frog was collected in America, and scientists wanted to know if they had discovered a new species, they would bring the frog back to a museum and compare it to the type specimens of known frog species. If the new frog had characteristics different from the type specimens, it might be classified as a new species, and that frog would be kept as a type specimen for the new group. If anything, Linnaeus's use of type specimens with essential characteristics is much more reminiscent of Plato's theory of forms than the earlier thinkers I've discussed. The impact of Linnaean thinking is hard to underestimate. In the great chain of being paradigm, zoologists were trying to figure out how all animals fit on a linear spectrum from lowest to highest. They were not doing a very good job at it either. Is a rhinoceros lower or higher than a lion? Pretty difficult to tell. But in Linnaeus's system, animals were clustered together by similarity. Potentially unbridgeable gaps were accepted, such as the gap between the kingdom of plants and the kingdom of animals. By thinking of species as distinct, fixed entities, creatures could then be clustered together based on their unchanging traits. The success of Linnaean thinking can be seen in Buffon's own work. By the second edition of his book, which was published the same year as his first edition, there's a complete change in tone. In the second edition he wrote, "We should regard two animals as belonging to the same species if, by means of copulation, they can perpetuate themselves and preserve the likeness of the species. For we have assumed that, in order that a species might be constituted, there was necessary a continuous, perpetual, and unvarying reproduction." This is a very different sentiment than what we saw in his first edition. However, it is important to note that Linnaeus did not think his higher order classifications were real in any sense. For example, since the orders of mammals were grouped together based on number and types of teeth, animals lacking 4 teeth, such as the platypus and the elephant, were lumped together. Similarly, in some of his earlier works, Linnaeus placed sharks with the amphibians, as opposed to the fish, because he incorrectly thought they all shared cartilaginous skeletons. These unusual pairings did not bother Linnaeus. His method was only meant to be a reference tool for looking up new species. He wrote, "In this arrangement, the classes and orders are arbitrary. The genera and species are natural. All true knowledge refers to the species, all solid knowledge to the genus." It was only later that naturalists began looking for patterns that might give logic to these higher-level classifications. There were a number of thinkers with different paradigms, but I'm going to discuss just one of them, Georges Cuvier. Cuvier is generally considered the founder of comparative anatomy and paleontology. Cuvier was also the first proponent of the idea that species go extinct. Based on his detailed studies of the geologic and fossil record, it became clear to him that not all animals have existed at all times. Instead, he proposed that God had undergone a series of creations and destructions during the history of the Earth. So Cuvier added logic to the Linnaean classification scheme through an idea called teleological functionalism. Teleological functionalism suggests that each part of an animal is an adaptation designed to help it survive in its environment. Not only must each adaptation help the animal survive, but each adaptation also has to functionally work with every other adaptation. Cuvier would not have tolerated tales of a mammal with insect legs, for example, because there'd be no way for the exoskeleton of the insect legs to function with the internal skeleton of the mammal. So using his method, Cuvier was able to divide all animals into 4 body plans, or embranchments. Because all adaptations in each animal had to be in perfect harmony, Cuvier strongly argued for species fixism. He also felt that these 4 embranchments were likewise fixed and unbridgeable. So regarding that question of the day, Cuvier would say that the animals which exist are constrained by the necessary harmony of parts defined in the embranchments, but each species is distinct because of its unique adaptations. Cuvier's paradigm doesn't allow for mermaids, because the backbone of humans and fish work in fundamentally different ways, and many characteristics, like long hair, would not be adaptive for swimming. Although Buffon died before Cuvier came up with these ideas, you can see the impact that the reality of higher-level classification could have on people's thinking. In the 4th edition of his work, Buffon wrote, "If it were admitted that the ass is of the same family of the horse, and differs from the horse only because it has varied from the original form, one could equally well say that the ape is of the family of man, that he is a degenerate man, that man and ape have a common origin, that in fact all the families, among plants as well as animals, have come from a single stock, and that all animals are descended from a single animal." Unfortunately, Buffon retreated from this idea in his book, and it took 100 years for a scientist to come up with a scientifically rigorous argument for evolution. That man, of course, is Charles Darwin. Darwin's famous for his detailed observations he made during his journey as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle. In South America, he not only recognized how distinct the organisms were there, but also that the extinct life forms in that region were similar to those unique life forms living today. In the Galapagos Islands, he saw finches and tortoises that were very similar to each other, but were uniquely adapted on each island to deal with different food sources. And in Australia, he saw animals that were so bizarre, he wondered to himself if a second god had separately created these unusual creatures. Ultimately, in his book The Origin of Species, Darwin shared his idea of natural selection. At its core, natural selection is a simple process. It requires variation, that differences exist between individuals, heritability, that differences in individuals can be passed down to offspring, and differential success, meaning that some variants produce more offspring than others. This law of natural selection has been studied for over 100 years since Darwin, and can now even be studied at the genetic level in populations. But the other important thing Darwin contributed, the thing that's most relevant to today's discussion, was the evolutionary tree, which can be seen here in one of his notebooks. Species are placed on the tree, depending on where they share a common ancestor. In this view, reptiles are grouped together because they share many characteristics that were present in the last common ancestor of reptiles. Mammals also share many characteristics they inherited from the last common ancestor, and because primates have a more recent common ancestor, they share more characters in common with each other than they do with other mammals. For Darwin, the reason why some animals exist and others don't can be explained by the evolutionary tree. Animals share characteristics because of common ancestry, and they diversify through natural selection. Interestingly, using Darwin's paradigm, there's 2 possible reasons why mermaids don't exist. One possibility is that there have never been the right combination of selective pressures on the right animal to lead to the evolution of the mermaid. The other possibility is that there are inherent constraints in evolution that have prohibited animals from evolving into a mermaid-like form. The conflict between these 2 ideas will be discussed later in the course. There is only one correct evolutionary tree, and since Darwin's book, scientists have been working hard to figure out what that tree is. Today, scientists build these trees using phylogenies, which show a series of relationships through time. In this tree, you can see that I'm more closely related to my sister than either of us are to my cousin. The reason for that is that we share a common ancestor, in this case my dad, which connects us on the tree at a node. Using the same methods that scientists use to reconstruct family histories, we can look and see who the closest relative is to the human species as a whole. In this phylogeny, it's clear that humans are more closely related to chimpanzees than either species is to monkeys. And we can move farther back in time to show that all primates are more closely related to lizards than either group is to fish. Since Darwin's time, scientists have been pretty confident regarding the basic relationships between the animals we are most familiar with, the vertebrates. This includes animals like fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals. But how the vertebrates are related to the invertebrates, which make up the majority of life on Earth, has been harder to determine. Knowing the correct phylogeny is critical to some of the questions we're going to ask in this class. For example, if we wanted to know if animals get more complex over time, we need to know which groups of animals split more recently and which groups are more ancient. We also need to know what the ancestors of these groups looked like at each ancestral node. Similarly, some groups of animals contain many species, while other groups contain relatively few. Based on the hypothetical phylogeny I've presented here, it looks like some lineages of animals have been more successful at evolving into new species than others. But if the phylogeny looks more like this, then the discrepancy in the number of species in each group might simply be explained by the amount of time each group has been around. Older lineages contain more species, and younger lineages contain fewer species. These issues, and possible answers to them, will be discussed later in the course. So to wrap up Lecture 1, Why Evolution, I want to note that patterns of animal life are best understood as connections created by common ancestry and differences created by natural selection. Phylogenies, or evolutionary trees, show us the patterns of evolutionary relationships. Next time, we're going to discuss heredity and look at current research which asks the question, how do parents transfer their traits to their offspring?